Welcome to the Meeting Underground. On today's special episode number 2, we have something a little different for you. An original composition, a 3-part narrative titled The Poem. Thank you for joining us. We hope you like it.
The Poem, a 3-act narrative by John Edward LaFave. Act 1, The Poem. Success, the accomplishment of an aim or purpose. The President had some success in restoring confidence. Craig Hamilton strides through a crowded sidewalk as he single-mindedly presses his way through the bustling throng toward the refuge of his New York City condo. Scene 2. Finally home, he collapses into a padded leather chair, pops a tab, and takes a long, large gulp from a cold Corona. The details of this ongoing trial swirl through his mind as he leans back and looks to the ceiling with wandering eyes. His mind slowly drifts back to the early years. Craig had begun very young, day trading in the 90s. After the dot-com collapse, he hustled to form what's known as a market maker firm, providing foreign exchange and derivative options to potential investors. As the firm gained respect and credibility, they knowingly began misrepresenting certain e-trading products and services, and it made them a lot of money. But over time it all soured, as these things do. They were eventually caught. Craig is now facing decades of jail time, court costs, and penalty compensations that will certainly deplete all that's left of his personal assets. Craig has always found it easy to justify his tactics. Just business, right? Still refusing to accept the consequences of his choices and what those choices have meant to so many others, Craig sulks, gazing out through a large wall of glass to the lights of the city below. Lost in thought for several moments, Craig suddenly awakens as he quizzically shifts a bit to his side and reaches back to pat the rear pocket of his pants. He retrieves a thick, folded piece of yellowed paper, inserted within the crease of his wallet. He looks it over, side to side, perplexed as to its origins. Half opening the folded form, he finds what appears to be a set of instructions, along with a list of a dozen or so names. The instructions end with these words: "When the verse has done its deed, add your name to the top, and when moved, pass it along." Craig fully unfolds the yellowed note to discover a short, 4-line poem. He reads it through several times, scrutinizing each line. Then, after a few moments, sets it aside and forgets the matter completely. Scene 3. The fall winds kick up into a blustery swirl of leaves. Craig smiles widely at a group of young children playfully jumping at a distance across a narrow field of grass. Months have now passed since the events of the trial and its mind-boggling verdict. Craig shakes his head, thinking back. The only thing more astonishing than the jury's unexpected ruling is Craig's own peculiar behavior and the transformation that has somehow happened within him, which he now traces back to the poem's discovery. It was only a few days after its reading, just as it seemed his lawyers were on the verge of turning the whole trial to his favor, Craig, for reasons beyond himself, suddenly and unexpectedly demanded they change the plea. In spite of his lawyer's outrage, Craig stood during proceedings, turned to the jury, and with tearful conviction confessed. "Do what you will with me. I am to blame," he shouted. "The things I've done were wrong, and I know it. I'll pay whatever you decide. I know I'm guilty." In the end, the jury did find him guilty, but on far lesser charges, with a highly unusual prearranged caveat, coordinated by the jury along with the judge. It required he make full restitution, serve no time, but remain on probation for 3 years, including a full year of community service. Craig's firm closed in bankruptcy, but no one else was charged or convicted. Craig cannot even explain how this was all accomplished, only that it was, and to his astonishment. Friendless, broke, and considered a pariah by most, Craig is daily overwhelmed at the sense of calm he now finds in spite of it all. His weekly community service with the homeless has turned the entire focus of his life on its head, and he cannot find words to explain it. Act 2. The People. So how can a simple 4-line poem do such a thing as this, muses Craig as he opens the mysterious yellowed note. He examines it once again, concluding the names listed are most likely those who themselves have received the folded surprise. Craig resolves to uncover who these people are and where this all began. After hours of online searching, several calls, and many false leads, Craig finally tracks down Margaret Lauren, the possible second name from the top of those listed. He finds her living as a patient resident at the Hillcrest Home for the Elderly in Hoboken, New Jersey. Making arrangements, a few days later he Ubers to the Jersey address to meet up with the woman in person. Scene 2. After proper introductions and pleasantries, Margaret conveys her story to Craig in detail. It was nearly 20 years ago while attending the funeral of my husband Drake, who was a decorated war veteran. He had died suddenly of a brain aneurysm, so at the funeral, I was approached by someone I didn't know or recognize, a stranger. He stepped up to me and handed me an envelope without saying a word. He just turned and vanished into the crowd of mourners. I thought it was strange, but construed the envelope to be a condolence card. Later that night, after opening it, I discovered I was mistaken. In the envelope, I found the folded yellow note. Craig asks her about the poem itself. Well, that night, more than 20 years ago, with all the grief of my husband's passing, I read this poem, and everything changed. I mean, everything. Instead of sorrow, I was filled with a deep, deep happiness and an unexplainable sense of calm. It was jarring, shocking. Craig's eyes widened while listening. As the days and weeks passed, the sensation continued and kind of, morphed. It morphed into my everyday life. It's hard to explain, but after a time, I think I became used to it, took it for granted. But even unappreciated, I have to admit, it still does persist, even today. Margaret tilts her head forward in a nod toward Craig. So what did you do with it? Stammers Craig. What did you do with the poem? Several years ago, having forgotten the note's instruction to pass it along, I made sure to add my name to the top and place it within the zippered pocket of my purse, which I kept with me at all times. Several weeks passed, filled with other pressing matters. Then one day, while standing at the checkout at Morgan's neighborhood market, I was taken by the estranged look on the face of a young black clerk working the register. Couldn't put my finger on what it was, something in his eyes. My heart went out to him. So when reaching my turn in line, for reasons beyond my normal demeanor, I was compelled to encourage him as he passed each item through the process. Then I remembered the poem and decided this was it. When concluding my checkout, the young man turned for just a brief moment to address another customer's question. I quickly retrieved the note from my purse and slipped it to the top edge of the register's cash drawer, a place he was sure to see it. Did you get his name or see him again after that? Questions Craig, looking to the name at the top of the yellowed list. Well, no, she explains. While returning home that same day, I took a fall and stumbled from an uneven curb, broke a rib. The injury left me hospitalized for quite a long time due to complications. Margaret looks wistfully into Craig's eyes. It's the inevitability of age. It all kind of ended up with me here at Hillcrest. Scene 3. Trevon Howard is in his third year of graduate work at NYU. He is working toward a doctorate in Black American Studies. The most recent turn of events has him mystified. Most recent, meaning the latest inexplicable oddity that has shaken and shaped his life so dramatically. The first being the discovery a couple years back of the bewildering folded poem. At the time, Trevon's hope of continuing his studies were deeply threatened by a police investigation that implicated him in a drugstore robbery which had happened a year or so prior. A robbery turned murder that by chance had Trevon at the scene of the crime. 2 of the 3 actual gunmen turned state's evidence, pleading guilty to lesser charges, and were falsely accusing him for that murder. Trevon's somewhat checkered past left him nervously anticipating the final results of the investigation. Well aware of the history in such cases due to his studies, Trevon was fearful to the point of panic. His deeply ingrained suspicion of the legal system had him expecting the worst. On the day of his encounter with Margaret Lauren, the burden of it had Trevon ready to bolt. He had made preparations with an old friend, PJ, to head off to Chicago, joining up with a gang of former friends who had assured him refuge. Finding the folded note, he opened it fully to discover the 4-line verse. Reading it left him puzzled, but intrigued. "Are you open?" a customer interrupted. Yeah, he replied. "Sure." The day's work ran its course, but Trevon continued to rehearse in his mind the words of the poem he had read. Scene 4. That night, while awaiting PJ's arrival, his thoughts were in great conflict. At odds with the fear driving him forward was a strange, nagging sense of hopeful caution, if there is such a thing. It persisted to interrupt his determined thoughts. Something about the final line of the poem was like a seed had been planted. Trevon found himself thinking in ways that were outside of his normal nature. It was like a tug-of-war being fought within his very brain. There was a loud pounding at the door, joined by the shout of a familiar voice. "Gotta go, T. We're out front." "Yeah," answered Trevon, removing the chain, unbolting, then opening the door. "Grab a bag." The 2 made their way down the hall, out onto the street, to an awaiting black van. PJ helped Trevon throw his belongings into the back of a packed vehicle, but began shouting obscenities at something he lifted into the light from among the other passengers' belongings. "What the hell is this?" he screeched, attempting to read the cover of a small paperback. "Ain't no way! Leaves of Grass by Walt Whiteman? Ain't no way! Not on this ride!" shouted PJ, tossing the ragged book to the ground. "Hey, bro, my bitch, she say poetry enlarges the soul," barked a low, gravelly voice from within the van. "Bitch knows the thing, you know." The van burst into roars of heckling response. Trevon stumbled back from the vehicle. The persuasion he had barely managed to suppress rushed back in full force. He stood staring at the tossed book as a wall of resistance rose from within him. "I can't," he mumbled. "Can't what?" retorted PJ. Trevon pushed him aside, grabbing frantically for his bags. "I can't do this." "Stop the shit, nigga. We gotta go." "Not me," he replied, then paused. "Not this time." The van erupted into bellows of cursing epithets. Scene 5. In the morning, Trevon woke to eye the blinking blue lights of his phone's notifications. Rolling over, he scrolled through the options, then shot to upright position. Rubbing his eyes with the back knuckles of his left hand, he read the subject line of the newly received email. It was from Tamara King, a lawyer friend from school. "Cleared," it read. "You've been cleared." Scene 6. Craig Hamilton steps to the service desk at Morgan's Neighborhood Market. As the attendant, busy with what sounds like a very contentious phone call, attempts to end it, repeating the same simple instruction over and over again. "Okay, sorry about that," the flustered woman says, turning her attention to Craig. "What can I do for you today?" Craig lifts the yellowed list for her to read. "It's about Trevon Howard. I believe he may have been or may still be an employee here." Not sure. Doesn't sound familiar," the woman replies. "It could have been a few years back." Wait," she says, turning toward the checkout. "Lawrence, do you remember a Trevon working here?" "Yeah, sure, Howard. He was part-time, working through school, I think. You wouldn't happen to have his contact number or his address, would you?" Craig asked the attendant, looking again to the note. "I have something I think might belong to him." "Give me a minute," the woman says, stepping aside to the tall gray filing cabinet near the back. After several minutes of rifling through files, she returns with a wrinkled application form. No phone number for some reason, but here's an address, not too far from here. That is, if he's still there. 1120 Roster Avenue South, apartment number 119. Act 3. The Poet. Knocking at the door, Craig does not know what to expect. After several moments, the door finally opens the length of a short restraining chain. A man jeers through the opening. "Yes?" he inquires in a low voice. Are you Trevon Howard? The door shuts. After a brief moment of silence, there's a rattling sound. The door opens to a very surprised Trevon. You're the guy, Hamilton. Scene 2. They sit at a dining table as Trevon fills him in on the events surrounding his discovery of the note. Craig tells him the story of Margaret Lauren and how she had passed it along to him, which bewilders Trevon all the more. Shaking his head, Trevon glares into the half-filled glass of Chardonnay before him. A few months back, I stumbled across something else that, well, it's truly beyond words. Trevon lifts his eyes toward Craig, staring. You have to understand, until this conversation, I have kept all of this to myself, explains Trevon. Yeah, I totally get it, agrees Craig, nodding. Who the hell are you going to tell this to? Well, it was while researching a paper on the contributions of Frederick Douglass to the abolitionist movement, explains Trevon. How much do you know about him? Well, not much. Author, activist, advisor to a few presidents. Here's some background. Born into slavery around 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. His mother was of Native American ancestry and his father was of African and European descent. He was born Frederick Bailey. It was his mother's name. Only took the name Douglas after he had escaped. He was separated from his mother as an infant and lived for a time with his maternal grandmother. But at the age of 6, he was taken away from her to live and work on the Rye House plantation, again in Maryland. Douglas was given like a piece of cattle to Lucretia Auld, whose husband, Thomas, in turn, gave him to work for his brother Hugh in Baltimore. Douglas himself credits Hugh Auld's wife, Sophia, with first teaching him the alphabet. Here's where it gets weird, says Trevon, taking in a huge breath. Craig leans back with anticipation as Trevon continues. Sophia Auld's name struck me as familiar for reasons I couldn't place. Then after a more scrutinizing search of her, I found this in an attached bullet point, and I'm quoting. In an obscure peripheral manuscript, Sophia Auld referred to an unusual conversion experience she had had from reading a brief poesis, saying, without doubt it changed the very soundness and course of my being, preparing me with a new empathy. That year would have been sometime in the early 1830s. And if you don't know, a poesis is a poem. Craig unfolds the yellowed note to its list of signers. Second from the bottom, he reads in a whisper, Sophia S. Auld. They both sit for several moments in silence. If there weren't all these unexplainable experiences attached to this thing, I would have excused it as an elaborate hoax, which I did for a time, confesses Trevon. But now? So how about me? Questions Craig. Why me? Well, after all of this, I just wanted to get rid of the dreaded thing. I'd had enough. I sat right here at this table, afraid to offend something beyond me. I pulled a pen from my bag and added my name to the top, explains Trevon. It was later that day while picking up a parcel at the post office that I saw you. I'd seen the coverage, and frankly, I was hoping to nail you good, confesses Trevon. But, again, something began to unsettle me. Simply sick of the whole damn thing, I pulled an old trick I'd learned on the streets. I took the note from my pocket, bumped you from behind, and slipped it into your pocket. Done with it. Epilogue. Where there's a poem, there must be a poet. The thought still plagues Craig without an answer. The whole matter confounds logic. It has been years since it all began, and Craig has learned to live with the unknown. Shortly after his conversation with Trevon, due to the historic aspect of what they had discussed, Craig decided to do a broader search on the subject for himself. He typed in several inquiries. Mysterious poem, poems that can't be explained, then finally, historic poems that have changed people. There was nothing resembling a real answer. That is until he reached the third page of results, where Craig found this minor reference. A manuscript of Roman origin speaks of, quote, by which a verse of 4 lines, i.e., the reading of such produces transfiguring. Nothing else could be found. Shortly after that, Craig penned his name to the top of the list. Finis.